Who else cares about elasticity? Well, clearly one of the things government officials would care about is elasticity. Why? Well, let's see if we can. Here would be a question. Should government be taxing elastic or inelastic goods? In other words, should we be taxing potatoes or cigarettes? Should we be taxing booze or paper towels? Right? Again, which of those do you think is it easier to find substitutes or has a more elastic demand? I would argue that paper towels almost certainly have a more elastic demand, price elastic demand than booze does, right? Than alcohol. So the question would be, which one should we be taxing? And I'm just going to have a simple set up here where let's assume constant marginal cost, a little bit different than the movie theater, but constant marginal cost. And so we would expect to be right there. Now I'm making a somewhat artificial use of this here, but now let's think about, we could look at this two ways. One is we're going to tax this much. And the question would be a tax on, so this was demand schedule A and demand schedule B. B, we think about this, the elasticity of B is greater than the elasticity of A. And so for a given tax, let's see which one raises more revenue and has a larger impact on well-being. So if we think about B here versus A. So clearly the tax on good A is going to raise more revenue. So revenue, or maybe I'll just put that as GA, is greater than GB. This is for the same size of tax. Okay, so that's clearly a boon for government officials, maybe, but we don't really care about that. What we care about is the impact on well-being. Now, we could go through and dump a lot of letters in here, but I'm going to try doing the shading thing that you all like to do so much. This here is going to be the deadweight loss, or the value of trades that no longer take place as a result of the tax for good A. And this here is going to be the deadweight loss as a result of the tax for good B. Which one has a larger negative impact? Turns out that the deadweight loss from B is greater than the deadweight loss from A. And so again, we raise more revenue and have a smaller deadweight loss if we tax inelastic goods, or goods that are relatively inelastic, for which they have a relatively inelastic demand schedule. So here's, now we can get more complicated. We can model this as raising the same amount of revenue. Let me think if I could actually do that on the fly. I'm not sure that I can. Taxes that raise the same amount of revenue. Let's think. Basically, what would have to happen in order to raise this same amount of revenue on tax on good B? In that case, we would have to increase the tax some more. And it turns out that already we may be in the elastic region. So, thus increasing the deadweight loss. But basically, if you think about this, this is exactly for a given, so there's two things. From a welfare point of view and from a revenue point of view, from a public policy standpoint, we would want to be taxing goods for which we have a relatively inelastic demand. And also, if we just go to a single good, right, say that we have decided for policy reasons to tax good B, it turns out that then it also matters whether we are, right, there's a point at which if we increase the tax too far, we actually will see a decrease in our revenue, just like a corporation would. This is what's called a Laffer curve. Basically, this is why eventually you can start increasing taxes sufficiently high that you actually see a decrease in revenue. And that's aside from the fact that people are maybe going to avoid taxes or try and evade taxes. This is simply just looking at the response. So we're looking here at a sales tax we could do the same thing with an income tax, right? Say that this is the supply of labor, this is the demand for labor. Again, you might have a question of why do we have a horizontal supply schedule? It's another question. Stick with me. Eventually we'll get there, or maybe not, but you'll have an understanding of why we might do that. So you could think about, we put in place an income tax equal to this distance here. This will be the revenue from the tax, and this will be the deadweight loss. If we increase the tax a little bit, say on income, what happens? Government officials will, right, from the point of view of the Treasury, we will lose this area here, but we will gain this area here. Now, as it looks like here, as I've drawn this, B is bigger than A. So increasing the tax, and again, we're setting aside all equity considerations and other things. We're just looking at how to maximize revenue. It would make sense to raise taxes, right? And then once we are at B at this point here, eventually, so maybe we increase taxes again. Well, as it's drawn, it's a little hard to see, so maybe we say, okay, that actually works out. But eventually we get to a point where we increase the tax, we gain that area there, but we lose that whole area there. And so past a certain point, increasing the tax rate actually is going to decrease total revenue. So corporations and governments would want to stay, typically, again, there's some possible exceptions, but generally speaking, would want to be in the inelastic region. It also turns out that we would want to, from a public policy standpoint, tax relatively inelastic goods. So who cares about this? Well, companies care about it. People who engage in business care about it. Policymakers should care about it. And we as citizens should care about it. So thinking about the things that we tax, now we tax property, taxing houses. Okay. Relatively elastic or inelastic? Depends on what we're comparing it to, right? That probably makes more sense than taxing Netflix, I don't know, HBO, right? I suspect there are more substitutes for that than there is necessarily for property. This actually would be the argument for taxing at a fairly high rate, for taxing alcohol and cigarettes. So it'd also be a reason for legalizing heroin and taxing it, legalizing drugs that are currently illegal, regulating them and taxing them. They're goods that probably have a relatively inelastic demand schedule. However, oftentimes, now this is a little hard for some of you probably to think about, but if we're talking about a state with a sales tax, oftentimes we end up taxing things that are relatively elastic. So one of the things we should probably tax would be staples, right? We would tax flour, we would tax rice, we would tax pasta, and we would maybe have a lower tax rate on ice cream and a lower tax rate on restaurants and hotels. A lot of areas, what they tax, they actually, if you've gone to conferences or traveled much, you'll discover that hotel taxes, and that's true in this town too, hotel and hospitality taxes are actually quite high. And if you think about where do we have a greater elasticity of demand, a price elasticity of demand? On groceries or on takeout restaurant food or eat-in restaurant food? I would argue almost certainly groceries are less elastic. In other words, we would want to be taxing groceries at a higher rate than we would want to be taxing restaurant meals. We would want to be taxing, hopefully that makes some sense. So again, hopefully you're starting to see that there may well be divergence with what we would want to use government for, the ways in which we would want to use government, and the way in which government actually is used and the policies that are generated by government officials.